I live in hope for the day that I don't have to lower a microphone after I'm introduced. I'm still waiting, not today. Mike, thanks so much for those kind words. To the board, thank you for having me and for extending the invitation. I was speaking to a group of doctors at a dinner event on Saturday night, and it very much felt like being a lion in a den of Daniels there. So it's nice to be back with lawyers again, back with my own kind. So thank you so much for having me. Look, as Mike said, I've had the privilege of working, practicing law and working in politics as well. And my wife, Fiona, and I, we left Australia for 7 years and just arrived back earlier this year. So we're newly Australian again over the last 6 months. And we spent 7 years, 2 years of it was in Oxford in the UK, and then 5 years, the last 5 years was in Singapore. And when we came back, it became pretty clear that those ancient Greek words of Heraclitus were true, that no man ever steps in the same river twice, because it's never the same river and he's never the same man. And the Australia that we came back to was very, very different to the one that I used to work in. I was involved in politics from around 2007 to around 2015, 16. And so it was a turbulent time. It was a circus, as it always is up there. But the Australia that I've come back to and the Australia that I've noticed and tried to track and make sense of over the last 6 to 8 months is much more divided. It's much more polarised, it's much more grumpy, it's much more angry and much more agitated. And something has definitely slid into the public square and the public conversation that was always lingering around just because of intrinsic human brokenness, but it's never been around with the level of prevalence that it is now. And that is this really scary, ugly, dirty thing called contempt. And Mike mentioned it, that when people disagree now, there is a tendency not to disagree with the ideas, but to disagree with the status and the integrity and the intrinsic value of the people with whom we're disagreeing. There's an old Netflix, not documentary, sadly this part of it does document something real, but an old Netflix drama called What If, where Renee Zellweger plays a multi-billionaire sociopath and manipulator. And she's the classic kind of Randian Machiavellian manipulator. She uses extortion and blackmail, she uses her money and her leverage to get what she wants. And there's a very telling and powerful line in this drama where she says, "Do you know what I hate the most? Having to listen to the moral ideas of lesser people." Having to listen to the moral ideas of lesser people. Now, it's easy to see how jarring a view like that is. But the sad and scary thing is there's a little moral judgmental person inside each and every one of us in here and out there that's at risk of doing that to anyone that disagrees with us, that tries to shut us down, that tries to cancel us. The capacity for Australians at the moment to engage with and even coexist with views that they disagree with is at an all-time low. Now, it's easy for us to think that this is the new thing, this is we're the first generation this is happening to, but as the late British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge said, history is just the same thing happening again and again to new people. So we are just the new people. It's taking a particular form at the moment. But what I want to talk about is to try and draw a few connecting lines between legal and political lived reality, theology, and philosophy, to kind of set the stage for this morning, to give you guys kind of like a philosophical and a political and legal theoretical backdrop and foundation for what subsequent speakers will come and talk about. So some of this is background, some of this is more about heart posture and theological and philosophical posture, but my hope and prayer is that it will provide some kind of a backdrop and a background on which other speakers for today can build. And my intention is not to tell you a whole bunch of things you don't already know. In fact, I think almost all of what I say you will already know, but it's to systematise it and present it in a way that's hopefully useful for you. Because we never step in the same river twice, and our country is constantly changing and we are constantly changing. So the need for responsiveness and agility and cross-disciplinary engagement is higher now, particularly in this space, than it ever has been before. Some of you who have been involved in organisational and leadership theory will have read a guy called John Kotter. And I think he was in Harvard Business School, he might still be there. And he writes kind of allegorical books about very complex aspects of legal and management philosophy. And he wrote a book that I found quite amusing about a colony of penguins And the book's called The Iceberg is Melting. Some of you are nodding, some of you will have read it. Nice and short, you could read it over lunch. And it's a book about change management, but there's a lot more truth and anthropological power and insight in it than just change management. And it tells a story of a colony of penguins, one particular penguin named Fred. And Fred is kind of a pretty junior ranking penguin in this colony. He's off swimming one day and he sees a crack in the bottom of the iceberg. He follows this crack and it becomes a fissure, a fracture. He follows that under the water and it becomes a cave, and he realises, he works out by swimming deeper and deeper and observing this, that the iceberg is melting. Something substantial to the foundation of this colony's existence is under threat, and it's melting. And so Fred the penguin does what any good, well-meaning penguin citizen would do. He goes to the Penguin Governing Council, and there's like a cabinet of penguins that are in charge of governing the colony and maintaining the iceberg. And there's like a penguin minister for the iceberg, there's a minister for weather projections, there's a minister for economic projections, for fish supply and all of this stuff. And Fred goes and tries to make his case. He says, look, there's a serious existential problem under here. This iceberg is melting and no one listens. In fact, one of the ministers in charge of the iceberg, his name, this is a penguin by the name of No-No. His name is actually No-No. And his first pivot is always to just shut it down, to shut down ideas that he's not up for, because it reflects badly on him, or he just doesn't like it, or he thinks of Fred, as per Renee Zellweger, as a lesser penguin. And so what Fred actually has to do is, instead of just kicking and screaming and raising his voice louder for what he wants to make his case, he has to be all of the things that I just very briefly mentioned. He has to step back, he has to be relational, he has to be strategic, he has to be thoughtful, he has to be cross-disciplinary, he has to build authentic relationships of trust with the influential penguins, both in and around the governing council. He has to make his case. He begins to build models of the iceberg to explain to people, not just that it's under threat, but how it's under threat, how this is actually happening. And then once he builds these authentic relationships, some of the penguins are willing to go with him. He takes them and shows them the cracks. He shows them the caves. He demonstrates to them. And over time, he gets them on board and they begin to see it. Even No-No begins to see it. And then, I don't really remember how it ends, but I think there's like a subcommittee that's formed to deal with this, and they migrate to another iceberg. So everything works out in the end. But it shows the need, when we are advocating for religious freedom, that just telling the truth is not enough. Just making the case is not enough. And even just being articulate and certainly just being loud is certainly not enough. It needs to be done in a way that is relational, that is thoughtful, that is firm, but is strategic, that is nuanced, that is agile, that is responsive, and that is necessarily cross-disciplinary. It has to be cross-disciplinary, because not everyone thinks the way that any one of us would think. Even in this room, there are different ways that we see and understand the world, given our professional and academic backgrounds, regardless of the fact that we may all share a particular faith and a worldview. And so I want to talk about three things in this context. There's plenty that could be said, but just three things that might give you a bit of a framework and an overarching system to think through this. Three things that we all need to do, all of us. First of all, we need to understand the landscape of faith. We need to understand what faith actually means and how it relates not just to people who have a religious faith, but for people who have what I'm going to talk about as non-religious faiths. So we have to understand the landscape of faith. Secondly, we have to clarify the posture of faith, particularly the posture of the Christian faith, because that's a faith through which we are engaging in the public square and doing the important work that this team and all of you are working. So we have to understand the landscape of faith, we have to clarify the posture of faith, and then we have to communicate the beauty and utility of faith. Both of those things together, the beauty and utility of faith. So first of all, we have to understand the landscape of faith. Now here's where I might sound a little controversial, but there is much more nuance to what is happening out there than what you see in the headlines, and than what you see from a lot of the advocates from all sides of things out there in the public square. When the Apostle Paul, goes to Athens in chapter 17 of the book of Acts, he first goes to the Jewish synagogue and he communicates the Christian message through the Jewish scriptures. Then he goes to the marketplace and he communicates it through the concepts of the marketplace. And then he goes to the Areopagus, which is basically a TED conference, and he gives a TED talk and he communicates it using the local poets and philosophers. Everywhere he goes, he's communicating ideas, he's using the vernacular and the understanding and the concepts and the reference points of his audience and of those people, and they're all open to what he's saying, at least to some degree. There are people who disagree, I'm sure, everywhere he went. We know at the Areopagus there are people who disagree, but there's also a level of openness and engagement. And so what the main street prevailing cultural narrative in today's modern liberalism in countries like Australia will tell you is that we are in Athens. We are in this place where you've just got to communicate your views respectfully and people are open and they will listen to you. Now, the reality is that there is an element of that. The fact that we can even have this conference shows that there's an element of that. But that's just not the case today in the way that we would like to think. This idea of a plural democracy and a plural liberalism isn't operating in the purest way that it possibly could. All ideas are not welcome in the public space. So we are not Athens, and any depiction of modern society in a sociological or a philosophical or a legal sense is incorrect. It's just wrong-headed. There's no evidence for it. We're not in Athens. The other way that this is often portrayed, our society, is that we're in Babylon, that there is persecution, that it's never been harder than it is now to be a person of faith, to be a Christian, that the heads are rolling in the streets, that people are getting cancelled, that people are leaving jobs and losing jobs. And with respect, and I think if we look at the nuance of it, that's not true either. We're not in Babylon. If for no other reason than simply the fact that Babylon was pre-Christian and this society is post-Christian. And most of the arguments that are happening now are happening at the level of ideals. There are irreducible concepts at the grassroots of civilization. Questions about what it means to be human, why we're here. Purpose, meaning, identity, morality. Those are first principles. Babylon was just cutting people's heads off at the second principle level. It was operating at the level of ideas, not ideals. Ideas are just suggestions as to a course of action or thought, whereas ideals are fundamental principles that reflect a particular conception of the good or the good life. And so this is not Babylon in the way that Babylon was Babylon. And trying to stir people up in our communities and in our churches by telling them that they're in Babylon is wrong-headed and it's irresponsible, it's bad theology, it's bad politics, and it's unread history. Just as much as telling people out there that we're in some kind of Athenian, wonderfully plural place where everyone's got an open freedom to share their views is equally ridiculous. We're somewhere in between. And we need to understand the nuances and the complexity and bring some sophistication to the public debate and the public square in what we're doing here. And if we want to be taken seriously, we're not in Athens, we're not in Babylon, we're in Australia. And it's 2023, it's post-Christian, it's difficult, there's tension, there's contempt, there's division, there's polarisation. But we're in a constitutional democracy, in a market economy, where generally capital moves, where generally thoughts and ideas can move, but there is a tightening around those thoughts and ideas, and that's why what we do is so important in advocating for and arguing for religious freedom and religious liberty, and all of the other freedoms and liberty that go with it as well, thought and speech and conscience and association, and so it goes down the list. But we're not in Athens and we're not in Babylon. It's a good headline, it's a good way to get an article published, but the reality is that we're just not in either of those places. We need to understand exactly where we are. This is where God has put us. This is where he wants us to work. Second thing to understand the landscape of faith is that everyone has faith. One of my favourite lines when Paul goes to Athens in Acts 17, I think it's in his speech to the Areopagus, he says, "I see you are all very religious." And you could say that when you look at Australia. And I'm not talking about the census, because when they use the word religious, they put a very finite, specific conception of it. But Paul is talking about faith, and faith is quite simply, etymologically, belief in something that is not preceded by deductive proof. So everyone is doing it. We're all doing inference to the best explanation. That's what everyone is doing out there. Whether you're a Christian, call yourself a Christian, or an atheist, or a Buddhist, or a Hindu, every human being in this country has a faith in something. They have an understanding of the system that they can't deductively prove, and they believe it by faith, either explicitly or implicitly. It might be accidentally, it might be intentionally, but everyone has a faith. So what we are talking about here is the freedom for religious faith. Yes, that is distinct. That's what this organisation and this project and this conference is about. But an important part of painting the picture in Main Street, in the public square, is to make it clear that this is not one group of people with a faith that just wants special treatment for their faith. Everyone has a faith. Everyone has a faith. Aristotle defined metaphysics as the study of first principles and first causes. And one thing about the public square today, politically and legally, is that it has attempted to abandon that. And that is where we need to paint a picture, a foundational picture, before religious liberty is advocated for. Now, it's not just because I'm in the middle of my doctorate on this, and I'm not going to take you through a history of liberalism because I want you to stay awake for the next speaker. But there have been broadly 3 primary waves of liberalism that affect the way we live today in modern Australian society. Enlightenment liberalism, which is kind of 16th, 17th century, which really elevated the idea of reason. Reason was the way we were going to work everything out. Then came the classical liberals that took that in the 19th century, people like John Stuart Mill, and they added an objective, utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. And then in the 20th century, we had people like Isaiah Berlin and the modus vivendi liberals. And modus vivendi is simply, most of you will know, it's the idea that, incommensurate conceptions of the good, disagreements, clashing ideas can coexist peacefully. That came along in the 1900s. And at the moment, we're kind of living in a hodgepodge of these 3 kinds of liberalism. And when I say the word liberalism, I'm not talking about little L liberalism, which is a political ideology, but big L liberalism, which is what we're all living under, which is a political and legal organising principle based on freedom, which is actually pretty important. We're all in favour of that liberalism. The problem with this kind of evolution of liberalism, if you like, or the genealogy of liberalism, is that it never really worked itself out. It never really worked itself out. So we have this hodgepodge now. It's a bit of a mess. But it's given us a lot of the things that people take for granted, a lot of the first principles, like the freedom of religion, the intrinsic value of all people, human equality. All of these things come out of this mess of liberal genealogy. But one thing it's tried to abandon from its very early days, and it's anyone's guess as to when that actually happened, but you can see it even in the early liberal writings, pre-Enlightenment, Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, is that it tried to abandon the metaphysical space. It said there are no first principles and first causes. We just have to work it out based on this idea of utility and technocracy and just improving the quality of life. When I worked in politics, I worked up there for 8 years, I think. And the only metrics of success, the only first principles that were talked about were actually second principles. They were optimising financial, health, education and employment outcomes. That's what good politicians do today. That's how governments are ultimately judged. And so there's no talk of the metaphysical. There's no talk of the metaphysical. It's all second principle outcomes. First principles have been thrown out the window. My doctoral supervisor, Professor Ian Benson, I was going to just plagiarise him shamelessly, but this is too good a word and I would feel bad. He calls it metaphobia. Modern liberalisms have metaphobia. We've been running away from metaphysics since Rousseau, right? For about 600 years, we've been running away from metaphysics. And the assumption is that you don't need metaphysics. You don't need first principles and first causes. You don't even need to think about them. That's the great liberal hope. That's the great liberal faith out there on Main Street. And it's incorrect. And part of what we need to do is to graciously and lovingly, but eloquently explain that that is incorrect, that everyone does metaphysics. And Aldous Huxley said it perfectly. He said, you can have good metaphysics or bad metaphysics, but you can't have no metaphysics. Everyone's got them. And in a modern liberal society, with all of its problems, one thing we can get out there and advocate for is that everyone deserves a seat at the table to make the case for and explain their metaphysics, their first principles and first causes, and then the fruit of those first principles and first causes that they espouse. That's good, functioning modern liberalism in a free society. But it's not just us bringing metaphysics, and that's the mischaracterization out there. Because everyone has faith and everyone brings their own metaphysics, even if they don't admit that they do. So all we're saying is that we should be allowed to bring ours. It's why the idea that you should leave your faith at the door for people of religious faith is so ridiculous, because they misunderstand that faith is not something that we hold, it's something that holds us. It's an ontology. It's part of who we are. It's an identity. It's ontologically grounded. It's equivalent to asking someone to leave their name or their head or their nervous system at the door. You can't do it. And we wouldn't expect anyone that didn't believe in a supernatural God to leave their atheism at the door, or a Muslim to leave their Islamism at the door. We wouldn't expect any of that. And so everyone has to come as their whole self to the public square and to the public table. But before we can make that case, we have to explain that everyone does have a faith, that everyone is bringing metaphysics, that everyone does bring first principles and first causes, and seen or unseen, explicit or implicit assumptions about those first principles and first causes. So we have to get right back to basics with the Australian public and with the public square and with people of influence and decision makers that we are speaking to about the building blocks and the first principles. Not to argue at the second and third principles. We have to do that, but we have to get these first principles clear first. That all people have a faith, that all people bring metaphysics, that first principles are not optional. You can have good and bad, but you can't have none. And anything we advocate for needs to be anchored in some kind of base level assumptions. So we need to bring that. And we don't need to be legal or political or theological experts to talk about that, even though most of you are some or all of those things, which is helpful. So understanding the landscape of faith. Second thing we need to do is to clarify the posture of faith. We have to clarify how we do things, not just what we do, but how we do them. Now, I know I keep pivoting back to the ancient Greeks, but they got a head start on a lot of this stuff before Jesus turned up. There's always an interesting Jesus-shaped hole in a lot of ancient Greek thinking, but they got a good start on a lot of this stuff. And they were good on citizenship, because ancient Greeks had three conceptions of political citizenship, political participation. They said there are basically three types of people. And I love how the actual Greek translates on all of this. The first type of person they categorise as the idiot. And the idiot is the person that doesn't care about civics and politics and what's going on outside of their own sphere. The idiot is the person that's just doing what they do with a closed mind. They're not interested in the headlines. They're not interested in what's happening around them, in the suffering of others, in the success of others, in the direction of their society. That's the idiot. Now, as a political junkie who was relentlessly made fun of by all of my cousins, all of whom are doctors, of course, I was very grateful that the Greeks called people that weren't interested in politics idiots. The second type of person, there's a few different ways of talking about this, but the best translation, in my view, is the tribes person. And tribes people sadly represent most political engagement today. You know what you believe, you know what you want, you know what your interests are, you know the kinds of people you want to hang out with, you know the kinds of Facebook groups you're in, the kinds of things that you retweet and tweet, the kinds of conferences that you go to, the kinds of people you have around for dinner. And you act and vote and advocate and engage publicly only in the interests of you and your tribe. And the third category of people, so said the ancient Greeks, are the true citizens. It's what they were going for. It's what their model of democracy, which is very different to our model of democracy, but it's what their model of democracy was kind of anchored in. People that act not just in their own interests, but in the interests of the broader flourishing of the community, in the interests of those around them. And when you read scripture and you read about the Judeo-Christian moral framework, it's the only one that maps onto what the Greeks would have called true citizenship. Acting in the interests of the broader flourishing. And it goes even more deeply and beautifully and powerfully through verses like Isaiah 58 and Matthew chapters 5 through 7, the entire book of Amos, you name it. Not just that we act in the interests of the broader flourishing of society, but for those who need it most, the disadvantaged and the downtrodden. Not just those who are struggling physically, but those who are struggling and have needs metaphysically as well. The Christian posture of public engagement and political and legal participation is to be gracious and humble while still being articulate and responsive to the needs of the community and to working for the broader flourishing of the community. It can't be seen as a posture of kicking and screaming for what we want because we need it. It has to be framed in a public interest. It has to be framed in a way that, exactly what Mike was talking about, that applies not just to us, It's not just for Christians, it's actually good for the whole team, the whole community, the whole nation that we're trying to build here together. Yes, we know that we're Christians first, but we're Australians as well. And we don't have to be Christians first and Australians second. That would be diminishing what it means to be Christian and misunderstanding what it means to be Australian. They're qualitatively different things. We can be both of them to the full in all metrics and realms of life at the same time. But we need to be committed to the project of Australia and its flourishing, both physical and metaphysical, both material and immaterial. And that's how we need to frame it. Because the ultimate metric of success is our posture of love. And Jesus is very clear about this. That's how they will know that you belong to me, by the way you love one another, the way you treat one another and the way you love one another. So the metric of how we do things is just as important as the political and statutory and legal successes that will no doubt be had, that I have full confidence will be had, that we all hope for and pray for and work towards. And there's a lot of the reason that we're all here for those outcomes. But those outcomes need to be reached with the right posture. Because according to Scripture, when Jesus comes back, he's not going to say, show me your statute books. Show me your legal precedents and doctrines. Show me how you've done shaping and influencing jurisprudence. He's going to say, show me your hearts. Show me your hearts and minds. Those are the things of eternal significance. Now, to be really clear, that's not to say that we should just be nice and not be interested in outcomes. Because a part of the act of advocating for religious freedom is an act of love. Everything we do for people of Christian faith has to be necessarily filtered into one of two channels, ideally into both. Either investing in our relationship with God or investing in our relationships with and loving those around us. And religious liberty is both. Advocating for religious liberty is both. It's an act of worship and obedience, but it's more directly and consequentially an act of loving our neighbours, regardless of their faith. For people of religious faith, for people of non-religious faith, it's an act of love because it's working towards the public and legal acknowledgement of the intrinsic dignity and freedom of a person based on the Judeo-Christian moral framework. It's an act of love. The reason I say that is because it's important that we remember that it's an act of love. Why Freedom for Faith exists is both shrouded and backed in and platformed by a motive of love. To love one another well, yes, to love the church well, but equally to love the broader community out there well as well. And loving people well isn't always met with love, isn't always met with the kinds of reactions that you would expect. But that's the important thing about the Judeo-Christian ethic of love. When you look at 1 Corinthians 13, everyone loves the first little bit, that it's patient, that it's kind. Even the atheists read that at their weddings. It's not until you get to the back end of Paul's treatise on love that the rubber really hits the road, that love gets gritty, that love really doubles down, that it rejects evil, that it rejoices in truth, that it preserves, that it protects, that it binds, that it looks out for the interests of its object, not for the feelings of its subject. That's the model of love we've got to bring to the public square, along with understanding the landscape of faith, to clarify the posture of faith that is one of love, distinctly loving. There should be a distinction. We're not just another shark in the dirty water of political lobbying and legal manoeuvring. We do what we need to do, but we do it out of love. And it needs to be seen that way too. So we've got to understand the landscape of faith. We've got to clarify the posture of faith. And thirdly and finally, we've got to communicate the beauty and the utility of faith. There's an obscure and sadly far too unknown philosopher called John McMurray. He's brilliant. You can only really get his books now secondhand. And I've got most of them, so if you want one, let me know. He was a Christian, and he said very powerfully that faith-based public engagement needs to be demonstrated while it is being argued for. Faith-based public engagement needs to be demonstrated while it is being argued for. That's enormously powerful in my view. It means that when Blaise Pascal said that we have to show them that it is beautiful and we have to show them that it is true, we can fulfill that while we are showing them why it has to be legal at the same time. There's no cart and horse here. It's not that we have to fight for religious freedom in order to then show them that it's beautiful and that it's true. There's some, legal aspect to that, and there's a lived out reality in the context of outcomes. But we don't have to choose. We can show them the case for why it should be allowed while we're showing them that it's true and that it's beautiful all at the same time. We can walk and chew gum at the same time on this. We need to demonstrate the beauty of it and the utility of it while we're making the case for the need for it. And at the same time, just doubling back to my earlier point, that everyone else should be making their case as well, for their first principles too. That's all we're doing. We're just making the case for our first principles, but we're going to show you and explain to you why this is good for everyone, whether you're a Christian or not. And that's what all of you, I'm sure, already know about. That's what a lot of my follow-up speakers are going to go into depth on, subject matter experts in the truth and goodness and beauty of the Christian message and how that actually works in real life and in society. Now, usually when I'm speaking, I'm not speaking to people with legal expertise, so I can say simple things and sound quite intelligent when I talk about the law. I can't do that in this room, so it's difficult. But I want to spend a bit of time on subjective and objective tests, which you all will know. And just looking over here, it may well be that I learned some of this from textbooks that were written by people in the room, embarrassingly. But our system of law rests on a number of things. One of the important things it rests on is objective tests, standards of reasonableness that are out there. And you often see this in cases where judges are looking at a law, they're looking at precedents, they're looking at principles of common law or equity law, and then they're looking at a real life situation. And it doesn't just automatically plug in like some mathematical formula. They've got to take it and discern how this should work and how does this apply to this in keeping with what's considered reasonable in our society now. These objective tests are hugely important. We see it in the duty of care. We see it in the entire development of equity law, over hundreds and hundreds of years. We see it in standards of reasonableness and what's considered reasonable. What's happening out there is an increasing shift from these objective standards to subjective standards. And it makes sense, it's not unexpected. In a market society, you see subjective experience elevated over objective experience, and there's lots of legal and political and philosophical and sociological and anthropological work out there, everything from Charles Taylor through to Alistair McIntyre to everyone in between, about how this is happening. But the reason this is to be dismantled, graciously and lovingly, but to be dismantled, is because once subjective experience becomes the standard, it's actually no standard at all. It's very much just reflecting the social media hashtags. It's you do you, your best self. We're walking around as Australians with 25 million, apparently, objective reference points. And when you have 25 million objective reference points, that's just a subjective reference point. There's nothing objective about that. And you can't build a robust legal system. You can't have the rule of law. The rule of law is talked about and sung about in news headlines by politicians of all stripes as this hugely important thing. Not many people are explaining to the Australian public what the rule of law actually is. And it relies on that. It relies on objective standards. So one of the things we need to bring to the table is the need for these objective standards. Then the question becomes, well, who gets to write them? And the answer is, in a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy, and a free market economy, all of us. We all get to contribute to those objective standards. We all get to contribute. And so the Judeo-Christian moral framework just needs to be another participant in that project of nation building. We're not the only participant. And we're not saying that everything that we say and everything that we want needs to be entrenched and legislated. So yeah, we're not in Athens, we're not in Babylon, we're not saying we need to be in Jerusalem either. We're not here for theocracy at all. But we're saying we deserve a seat at the table. And the way that this framework of objective reference points, of societal standards, of civilizational values, of first principles, whatever you want to call them, the way that it works needs to be explained to people too. It needs to work like an alloy, not like a mosaic. The problem with plural society is that most people understand it as, well, you come and be who you are, I'll come and be who I am, and we'll have this beautiful mosaic. And a lot of the language around diverse societies are this picture of a mosaic, which is just disparate and unworkable. What we actually need is an alloy. when everything strengthens the common metal. It strengthens what's common. And once you feed into an alloy, every metal is still involved in the chemical composition of the resulting alloy, but every metal also gives something of itself. There's an element of sacrifice. Every metal is not perfectly constituted in the alloy. And so that's an important part of faith-based public engagement. We feed into the alloy, but we can't expect to feed in and remain exactly as it is. We're not saying take the Bible, control A, and then control V into political and legal infrastructure. We're saying let us come to the table and contribute to this. And the basis on which we do that, and the historical basis on which we do that, is enormously powerful and beautiful, because it's not rocket science, and you can see it in thinkers like Tom Holland and others recently that show that so much of the fruits and the infrastructure of liberal democracy is thanks to the Judeo-Christian moral framework. It's no coincidence that Jacques Maritain, as many of you will know, the Catholic philosopher who was part of the group that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, and he came out of there, and in there were also other political and legal and religious leaders of various faiths and no religious faith, and they came out and they said, we've got this thing for you. And geez, it looks Christian, doesn't it? And no one said a word. And then when people asked them, the media and the public said, how did you guys come up with this? They said, please don't ask us. There's no reasoning. Don't ask us to show our working. This is not a maths exam. Trust us, this is what we need. And what do we see? Intrinsic human dignity, freedoms of speech and thought and conscience and religion, right to own property, freedom of movement, equality between the genders, all of these Judeo-Christian ideas coming through. So the legacy of us being at the table, bringing our physical and metaphysical, our intellectual and theoretical, our first principles and our second principles to the public square, has a great track record, arguably the best track record in Western civilization and the most important. But all we're saying is we want to keep being a part of the conversation. We want to keep a seat at the table for the broader project of human flourishing. Because that's exactly what the Judeo-Christian ethic is centered around. Jesus said, I've come so you can have life and have it to the full. And when he says life in the Greek, he's talking about two kinds of life. He uses two words, bios and zoe. Life here, bios, and zoe, eternal life as well. The physical and the metaphysical. So it's dark out there, friends. It's dark and uncertain in many ways. But when I see people like you doing what you do, and I see the board and who it's made up of, and I see conferences like this being attended in this way, and I see the other speakers that come after me, I know that in more ways than one, there is light in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. Thanks so much for having me. Bless you guys.
Thank you, Max. Does this work? Or am I just really loud? Okay, we have some questions that have come in through Slido. And this is the moderator. This is the beautiful thing, rather than just take up hands, I get to choose. It's wonderfully empowering. So I must start with a question that was being raised by one of my board members.
Yes.
My professional review is very soon.
Right.
Even though we all have a metaphysic, can we not operate effectively in cooperation on the secondary areas? Can we not just live in that space? Why bother even discussing the metaphysics in the first place?
Yes, absolutely we can. Absolutely we can. And that's exactly what we need to do. I didn't say that explicitly, but yes, that's exactly what we need to do. That needs to be the outcome and the form of public engagement. The reason I talked about metaphysics and made that case, which no one will ever make to you because it puts most people to sleep, and it doesn't cut headlines and you'll never get heard in public on it, is purely to highlight the reality that everyone does have a metaphysic. That's the key. That's as far as we should go. Going into the metaphysic is, an element of evangelism. That's something we should invite people over for dinner or to church for. Doesn't need to be part of the public engagement. We're not doing, political apologetics in the public square. But the point I was making was we need to get people to the point where they see that everyone has a metaphysic. We need to get them to see that Huxley was right, not Mill. You can't have no metaphysics. In saying there are no metaphysics here, that's a metaphysical position. In saying that society is not moral or immoral, it's amoral, that's a moral position. That's the point I was trying to make. But yeah, beyond that, the second principles are the only place that we need to learn to cooperate, because it's the only place we reasonably can, because there's always going to be a clash at the first principle level. But we clash over those over beer and coffee. But in the public square, we go at the second principle.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Second question. How influential and open-minded do you think younger generations, which has been defined as under the age of 30, which I may object to, but...
Yeah, I do too. I second that. Yeah.
How influential and open-minded do you think younger generations are in all this? And how do we equip them as the next leaders?
I think,
question.
yeah, it's a great question. My view, having once been a young person, is that they're much more open than we give them credit for. And they're much more open than we think. And I think the megaphones and the grandstanding we see in the public square, and even more so in social media, are not representative of where most of the people are most of the time. I think what you have is a sense of despair and hopelessness and nihilism. I don't know if anyone saw the article in the Herald a couple of weeks ago about the new nihilism, where young people claim to be nihilistic now, but if you read it, it's actually not nihilism. Nihilism, as Nietzsche said it, was the loss of all meaning. Whereas what these people are saying is, the message I'm getting from young people is that they don't trust anyone anymore. They don't trust our systems, they don't trust older generations, and so they are having to create meaning for themselves. And that's very different to not being open to something. There's a need for hope and a need for meaning and a need for narratives of redemption that they would be open to. So the erosion of trust in modern society, I think, is the biggest problem. That's what we have to work against. The symptom of that is that people seem closed-minded. But I think that's just a struggle to find people and messages and narratives that they can trust in again.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think there's more hope out there than we think with young people.
So this follows on a statement for you to respond to.
Yes.
It's not just metaphysics. The liberal frame to discuss metaphysics in is contested itself as hegemonic and oppressive.
Yes.
That must be destroyed to emancipate people.
Yes.
Discuss.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. I love a good debate. So that statement has a metaphysical underpinning. Like, if this idea is hegemonic and needs to be dismantled, do you believe that to be true? Do you believe that to be unconditionally true? Do you believe that to be objectively true? And the answer to all three is yes. And that's why C.S. Lewis put it very clearly. He said that we're all dogmatists. Everyone's dogmatic. There are only conscious dogmatists and unconscious dogmatists. And this kind of unconscious dogmatism, Lewis says, is the most dogmatic kind. Because they don't understand that there is a metaphysic to that. And I think that's okay. That should be that view should be represented at the table. But let's not pretend that there's not a metaphysical set of assumptions under it. You've got to make your case for that. And that's fine. I think they are making their case. I think they have plenty of platform to do that. All I'm saying is that people who disagree with that should be able to make their case too. Not Rousseau, Derrida. Jacques Derrida is great on this. He, in my view, was the most articulate and eloquent postmodernist, and the most amusing too. He said, if what we're saying is the case, that you can't actually know truth, then even what I'm telling you now, you have to question. Even this might not be true, and even this sentence, and even this, and there's like an infinite regression of commas that he has to add, because at some point, as C.S. Lewis said, you just keep looking through windows and you're not looking at anything. So that's fine to say, or even this frame is, hegemonic and oppressive and needs to be emancipated from, but that's just another dogmatic statement that has metaphysical assumptions. Yeah, that's just another first principle. So let's get our first principle together and have some fun.
Last question.
Yeah.
You rightly commented on the value of Greek politics and also on Judeo-Christian. Any thoughts on the value of Eastern politics, like Confucius?
Yeah, plenty of value. I just spent, like I said, 5 years in Singapore and speaking around Asia a lot. And again, there's plenty in Eastern thought, especially Confucius, but not limited to Confucius. A lot of the Indian and Hindu thinkers as well are in this space where there's plenty of truth there, and plenty of hope and plenty of light in a lot of what those folks were writing about and thinking about. But once again, I found and I'm not anywhere near as familiar with Confucian and Eastern thought, despite how I look, as I am with Greek thought. But from what I have seen, there's wonderful utility and wonderful truth and sophistication in that thinking. But it always, for me, I still end up seeing a gospel-shaped hole in it. and I don't want to be derogatory in using the word whole, but there is a shortcoming. There's something to be fulfilled there. And so I think that's definitely useful, and we should use that. That's what I meant when I said we should be cross-disciplinary. We need to get our heads and our hearts into other strands of thinking. We need to be reading, authors and thinkers who are not aligned with us on our metaphysics. We need to be listening to podcasts and watching movies and reading newspapers. We can't just be theological. That's not the language they're speaking out there. That can be our underpinning. That can be our heart and our identity. But we need to become translators into modern political, legal, and social and cultural parlance. And that's how we'll get this done.
Excellent. Thank you, Max.
Thanks, mate.